One of my personal treasures is my Grandma Bonnie's sewing machine. It is a Pfaff circa 1960, and my grandma was so proud of that machine. With it, she sewed clothes for her girls, clothes for their doll babies, clothes for their real babies, and clothes for those babies' doll babies. There was nothing my grandma couldn't sew. She could also knit and crochet, and I have strong memories of her sitting in her armchair of an evening, an Afghan growing progressively longer on her lap. She kept our winter feet warm with her knitted slippers, and although the last pair of those that I ever owned has long since worn out, it's not a problem because I can actually make them myself now because my grandma taught me to knit and gave me her pattern. In fact, that was my first knitting project ever, a pair of slippers. They were green. I made them for my husband back when we were newlyweds. Never mind that those slippers turned out to be about 4 inches longer than his feet, a real tripping hazard. They were made with love, and not just my love, but my grandma's love, because she gave me that gift. So today's story, it's from the book of Acts, and it's about a woman like my grandma. Only this woman's name was Tabitha. She lived about 2,000 years ago. Here's her story as told in the 9th chapter of Acts. Now in Joppa there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is called Dorcas. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At that time she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. Since the town of Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples, who heard that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him with the request, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter got up and went with them, and when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. Peter put all of them outside, and then he knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then, calling the saints and the widows, he showed her to be alive. This became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. It's a pretty amazing story for several reasons. The most obvious one is that Tabitha gets resurrected, which is a pretty big deal, but not unheard of. There are 10 resurrection stories in the Bible, including the resurrection of Jesus himself. But of all 10 resurrection stories, Tabitha stands out for several reasons. First, her name is used. That is rare, even for a resurrection story. Even more rare, Tabitha is one of only 2 females to be resurrected. But the most important difference in the story, what sets it apart from all the other resurrection stories, is this. In the middle of recounting the miracle, the author pauses to tell us a little bit about the dead person's life. That is unusual. With the exception of Jesus' resurrection, all the other stories are not really about the person being resurrected. They are more about the person performing the resurrection, and ultimately they're about God's power being used through that person, which still holds true in this story. We're supposed to be impressed by Peter's new ability to restore a dead person to life, clearly a spirit-infused gift, if ever there was one. But for just a moment, the author of Acts stops and shows us something about the woman being resurrected. She's got a story. She lives in this town called Joppa, and she is called a disciple of Jesus. Incidentally, this is the only time in the Gospels that the feminine version of disciple is used. And what a disciple she was. We learn thanks to the widows who crowded into the room to tell Peter about their friend, that she was known for making tunics and other clothing. It's a poignant scene. Filled with grief, the widows weep. But the focus is not on the dead body of Tabitha. The focus is on the work that she had done during her life. I picture the widows telling Peter all about their friend, gesturing to the many articles of clothing that filled the room in various stages of completion, most of it destined to be given to those in need. And that was a really big deal in those times. It might be hard for us to fully grasp just what a big deal that clothing was, those tunics and other things woven and stitched together by Tabitha's capable hands. But for those ancient people, the single most time-consuming task of all the many tasks required to run a household, it was the making of clothing. Those of us who make clothing now know that it does take a long time. Also, we have sewing machines. And I don't know about you, but the clothing that I've made with cloth that I bought from a fabric store. I did not have to spin and dye the thread or weave it into cloth. Even knitting, which is really slow, the making of fabric, one little stitch at a time, is really pretty fast if you didn't have to shear the sheep and dye the wool and the whole process. Making clothes in Tabitha's time, it took a lot of time, which is why most people only owned a little bit of clothing. One tunic, one coat, not two. That meant that if something wore out, and if the person couldn't afford to replace it, that person was literally naked, or at best, wearing the equivalent of underwear. Someone like Tabitha, therefore, was a lifesaver. She made clothing to protect people from the harsh daytime sun and the chill of the night, and so they could keep their dignity. We're told that her life simply overflowed with good works and compassionate acts on behalf of those in need. She was a true disciple. I'm very grateful to the author of Acts for bothering to record all of these things, because Tabitha very likely couldn't record her own story. Most women in that time and place were not taught to read or write. Of course, her story would have been told orally by those who wept for her, also women who had no way of making the story permanent. But does it matter, the story of someone like Tabitha? Does her discipleship count as much as the discipleship of the others? You know, the famous disciples like Peter and Paul. They were pretty amazing. They preached, they healed people, they spread the good news of Jesus Christ to many and faraway places. They started churches, creating more disciples, and here we are today, far away in both time and space from where it all began, all because of the evangelism of Peter and Paul. They even left a written legacy of letters, which we find instructive to our faith lives even today. And they raised people from the dead. It's pretty hard to compete with that, isn't it? In fact, I find myself in my own ministry pretty underwhelming if I even try to compare myself to disciples like Peter and Paul. They were pretty much rock stars in a very first century way, unplugged. But you know, the world doesn't need a lot of rock stars. What we really need is more Tabithas. Tabitha is the perfect example of a woman who used what she had, needle and thread, to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, who told his disciples that they were literally clothing him whenever they clothed the naked. Peter and Paul, they raised the dead, but Tabitha made life better for the living. And at her death, we see people literally bound together by her love, those who showed up to mourn for her. I picture her as someone who wove her community together, maybe even binding together people from both the Aramaic and Greek cultures, who called her different names, but knew her to be one very loving person. I wish that we knew the rest of her story. But even though we aren't told, I think I can imagine some of it. She probably continued her clothing ministry, because that is what people like Tabitha do. They do their best as long as they are able. But what I really want to know is this: did Tabitha create other disciples? Because being resurrected once is great, but I'm sure she eventually died and stayed that way. And then what happened? Did someone follow in her footsteps, continuing the business of sewing clothing for the needy? I certainly hope so. Because it is one thing to do good works, to act out of mercy and compassion, to be disciples. But none of us will be around forever, which is why one of the most important things for disciples to do is to create more disciples. And that is what we, the church of today, can learn from this very old lesson, from the acts of this very special disciple. Each of us has the potential to do something that can bless people in the name of Jesus. Maybe our gift is with fibers, like Tabitha and my grandma. Or maybe we speak love through cooking food and sharing it. I like those people a lot. Or maybe our gift is friendliness, the ability to connect with people. That's a gift. Now, I'm not going to name every single way we can be disciples, but I'm hoping that you know what your own gift is and how to use it. But I also wonder, how did you get that gift? Someone taught you, right? Even the gift of an outgoing personality, someone brought that out of you. They spent time teaching you how to converse, how to ask engaging questions, how to listen. We all had a Tabitha in our lives. Maybe it was a mother, a grandmother, father, grandfather, a teacher, a neighbor, a family friend. We've all been discipled one way or another, been given the skills and tools to make our world a better place in ways little or big. And the person who taught us, well, we honor them. We remember them. We miss them. They are the disciples who have gone before us, the ones whose names might be etched in stained glass in church windows, burned into the wood of memorial park benches, carved in bricks in hospital gardens. We pay tribute to the Tabithas of the world who have left their mark of blessing. But as the days and years unwind, like the yarn on a variegated skein, those Tabithas become part of the tapestry of the past, remembered in stories and pictures, but no longer weaving their daily lives with ours. Yet we remain connected because we take on their ministries, continuing the work they began, the work that they prepared us to do. But it doesn't stop with us. I mean, it could, but it shouldn't. We have the responsibility, Jesus said so, to go and make disciples of others so that this work might continue long after the length of our skein has been unspooled, the last little bit woven into the tapestry that is the history of our faith. No one in a right frame of mind would take scissors to a thread of such beauty and snip it. It'd be ruined. Instead, we're to pass along what we've learned in this life, to teach others to do what we have done, knowing that they might do it in a slightly different way, but that they will keep doing it, blessing others in the name of Jesus Christ. My friends, if we are to learn anything at all from this wonderful book called The Acts of the Apostles, it is about the business of faith sharing. We might not have the particular gifts and graces of Peter or Paul, but that's fine. I've known very few people in my life who have that level of spiritual gifting, but the people who have touched my life, they are more like Tabitha. They're my grandma who taught me how to make things for people I love. They're the Sunday school teachers and youth group leaders who taught me how to open my heart wide to Jesus and all the people he loves. They're the people who cook for the homeless, who knit prayer shawls for the sick and the hurting, people who play music for the residents at the nursing home, folks who do housework and yard work for those no longer capable. And how is any of this possible? Because someone taught us to do these things. So let us do likewise, so that the thread of Jesus' kingdom work here on earth will never be broken.